And he said that not just because he knew that everybody knew in Latin America or in the Jesuits, but because it's part of his spirituality. That so if you compare the careers of the popes of the 20th century, if you could put them on two axes, I mean, you see a steady ascent. Right? The right friends, the right enemies, so it's a steady ascent. So with Francis, it's like that. I mean, like the stock exchange. I mean, every day that he knows that, and that's a great thing because he knows how important it is for the pastoral dimension of being church, of acknowledging failure also in its leaders. The third thing is the element of governance. He's a Jesuit pope who has a complicated relationship with the Society of Jesus, and I'm not saying anything else here because it is complicated. It is complicated, but it's clear that the way he wants to govern the church, he's taken from some aspects of how the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, govern themselves. The Council of Nine Cardinals, the language of discernment, a more collegial synodal church. This is really new. It's something new. And having a Jesuit pope can be seen as unconsciously the Catholic Church really calling the ambulance and saying, we have a very serious emergency here, so let's call the specialists. So there is something here, and the big issue out there is what will remain of these new, very important elements in church governance after Pope Francis. This is something that I'm personally hoping and working that it will stay there. A fourth element of his being Jesuit is his being Pope, not as an isolated monarch, but his experience has been largely lived in a community, whether it's a real community or not. I mean, living with real people every day in the same house, whether or not, but it's the idea that your life is spiritually and psychologically much healthier if you live in a community, which was one of the ideas, for example, of the Second Vatican Council, when the idea was we shouldn't have every priest living alone in his parish. We should have priests living together. And that was rejected. But that was one. So he has a deep sense of community, existentially, psychologically, living with other people, and not just with your dossier. I don't want to be disrespectful here, but I don't know if you remember of those stories of Pope Pius XII speaking only with his canary. And I don't know if that's true, but so those rumors, I mean, you cannot imagine somebody saying that about Pope Francis. It's impossible saying that about Pope Francis. Okay, so here there is really a mutation in the papal office. It is not just giving up the papal apartment, it's much more than that. Final is that as a Jesuit Pope, he has a vision of the global church that I think is part of the global vision of the church and of the world that was part of the Society of Jesus from the very beginning. I visited the historical archive of the Society of Jesus in Rome a few years ago, and you have these letters of these Jesuit missionaries to Asia, and the instruction was that every letter had to be written in double copy and sent one eastward and the other westward. So you were fairly certain that at least one would reach Rome. So there is this idea that the church and the world are coextensive. The church is not just a European thing that accidentally landed also in other continents. That's not that. Finally, last 5 minutes, is this. Francis is, in a sense, the first post-Vatican II Pope. He is the first Pope who was elected who was ordained priest after Vatican II, who was not at the Second Vatican Council in any way, shape, or form. Paradoxically, if you see what I'm saying, his relationship with the pre-Vatican II Church is quite similar to my relationship with the pre-Vatican II world. It's there, it was good. It was not anti-Christian, anti-Catholic, or unfaithful, but it's there. And our church has moved on. There are many words that you can look for in the vocabulary of Francis. You will not find the word nostalgia. That's not part of his vocabulary. And so here, what is really interesting is that he doesn't use the theology of the Second Vatican Council and builds on those few paragraphs, which is a legitimate way of doing that. But what he's doing is to look back at the meaning and at the method, at the theological method of the Second Vatican Council, to do the same thing in our times. And in this sense, it is telling that the most important document of the Second Vatican Council that Francis uses is the Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes. The last document of the Second Vatican Council, approved one day before the end of the Council. But it's the most important document of the Council for Francis because Gaudium et Spes was a document that at the beginning of the Council was not supposed to be one of the final documents of the Council. Nobody in 1960-62 had an idea of a document like that. And it's the final document of the Council because it's the final word of the Council on what Vatican II really was about. It's like taking a long walk and at the end looking back and say, this is what we have done. That is Gaudium et Spes. It's a new method of doing theology. It's not a bunch of statements, but it's a narrative of how to be a church in the modern world, the signs of the times, the church that lives in the world and in history, in this history, doesn't live on another planet and in another time. So here Gaudium et Spes is clearly the most important theological text of the Second Vatican Council for Pope Francis, and again is one of the most visible differences from Pope Benedict, who always thought Gaudium et Spes is behind the naive optimism of Catholic theology in these last 50 years looking at modernity and the modern world. So here there is a very different appreciation of this document. And here finally, one final thought. One of the most interesting things of Francis is that he's doing Vatican II without basically ever mentioning Vatican II. That is the secret. Because Vatican II has become, in some cultural context, especially like the United States, really something generational, something that is automatically cast as liberal theology, or worse. I mean, liberal used in a negative sense. So he's doing Vatican II a lot, every day. I mean, how being in Auschwitz today and praying only with Jewish scriptures, for example. So he's doing Vatican II all the time, but being aware that Vatican II as an expression can and must be used with caution, because our rhetoric in the church around Vatican II in these last few years had become a rhetoric of division, of polarization, which is exactly the opposite of what Vatican II is. So not what wanted to be, but what it is, because it was a council about the role of Scripture, about Jesus being a Jew, about all these things. So he's recovering Vatican II, and he's saving Vatican II from a certain inflation of that terminology that was applied often to things that are only very loosely connected with what Vatican II